We are extremely fortunate to have two speakers from the Biomimicry Institute, whose website says that they are inspiring, educating, and connecting biomimics throughout the world. And biomimicry is a fascinating area, and you will probably, if you're not familiar with it, I think you'll be very interested to learn from the presentation. We're fortunate to have Bryony Schwan, who's the executive director, and before joining the Biomimicry Institute, Bryony founded Women's Voices for the Earth and served as its executive director and then program director for 12 years. And during that time, she also co-funded the national campaign for safe cosmetics. So Bryony received her MS in Environmental Studies from the University of Montana and a BA from the University of Natal in South Africa. And our other speaker today is Mark Dorfman, who is the green chemistry naturalist at the Biomimicry Institute. And he has spent the last several decades as a research scientist for public interest, not-for-profit environmental organizations, primarily in FORM, Inc. and the National Resources Defense Council, with a focus on green chemistry and clean water issues.
As Lynn mentioned to all of you, I worked on chemical policy for a long time and was part of the Coming Clean Network and the Chemical Industry Working Group. And it was really interesting to me to shift from chemical advocacy work to biomimicry, simply because I found when we were doing work around chemical policy and advocacy around toxic chemicals, so often we bumped up against this problem of, recognizing that we had a series of toxic chemicals that we had to deal with, but not being able to advocate for what an alternative was. Or many times, at least, having to advocate for a less toxic alternative, but nevertheless one that was still toxic and problematic, but maybe not quite as bad as the chemical that we were replacing. And so I found that whole concept quite frustrating. And so when I started to move into the world of biomimicry, I did so because Janine Benyus, who wrote the book Biomimicry Innovation Inspired by Nature, has been a longtime friend of mine. And many times we would talk about how our work intersected in terms of the work that I was doing on chemical policy and what she was doing in the biomimicry world and consulting with a lot of companies who were trying to solve problems. And what I discovered with biomimicry is that it gives you a range of solutions that go so far beyond just the sort of substitution solution. An example of that, and I know Mark will go into it in greater depth in his presentation, but an example would be if you were trying to get rid of a toxic dye, for instance, in the textile industry, or many applications, you would ask the question about, well, how would nature make color? And what you discover is that actually, in many cases, nature uses structural color, which is actually the shape of the surface of a particular material. So for example, with a morpho butterfly, its brilliant blue wings are not from pigment, but rather from the surface structure of its wings that reflect blue light. So the solution is quite different than just replacing a particular chemical. And so that's what got me really excited about biomimicry, because it really does open up a whole new way of problem solving. So Mark will run through a number of case studies for you, and I was going to talk about a little bit about life's principles, Mark, but I saw in your presentation that you've got that, so I won't go into it now. I do just want to say to folks that before Mark does his presentation, we do unfortunately have a lot of problems with copyright on photographs, so we do ask people please not to use any of the images in his presentation without getting prior permission from us, because we sometimes have only a one-use permission from the photographers. So I'll hand it over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Bryony, and thanks everybody for joining this presentation today. And I call it Nature is Alive with green chemistry because chemistry is really at the basis of much of what the living world has learned how to do. And it's green because after 3.8 billion years of trial and error, the 30+ million species that are still alive today are alive today because they've figured out what works, what lasts, and what's appropriate, particularly within the context that they live. They're not able to do their chemistry somewhere else and then go home. They have to do their chemistry where they live, so they can't afford to create hazardous conditions and deplete resources where they live and work and where they rear their young. So in looking at nature's chemistry and biology, there's a set of life principles that have sort of emerged that is common throughout ecosystems, throughout taxa, throughout organisms, and some of them are listed here. This could be a workshop in and of itself discussing life principles. The foremost is that life creates conditions conducive to life while they're doing their chemistry. So just think about it, that green plants give off oxygen as a byproduct. They also filter water. Their constituents, their actual structures, once they reach the end of their useful life, they actually compose to enrich the soil, which is quite in contrast to how industry deals with its waste and the consequences of industrial chemistry. Also, life does its chemistry at ambient conditions of temperature and pressure. The chemistry is water-based as opposed to petrochemical-based. Self-assembly is often used to do the reaction. So you're utilizing the positive and negative charges, the other types of repulsive and attractive forces like hydrophobicity and hydrophilicity, sort of utilize those to leverage them to facilitate reactions. It uses freely available energy sources, solar energy, chemical energy. It often uses catalysis and chemical specificity, so you don't create byproducts in the first place. And of course, cyclic material flows and freely available compounds. So this upside-down pyramid shows the relative abundance of elements that are found across organisms. So we see that all organisms have, in greatest abundance, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen. In lesser amounts, but also in all organisms, are many of the mineral compounds. Also in all organisms are small but essential amounts of metals. But in just trace amounts in some organisms are many of the other elements that we see in industry used in large amounts. So you have aluminum, bromine, chlorine, silicon. So just imagine if the profile and the distribution of elements that we use in industry to create all our products and processes mimic that of nature. So I think it's pretty obvious at this point that given the context that nature needs to do its chemistry, that nature is probably the most advanced, the most interesting source of information for green chemistry. If you look at the green chemistry principles kind of summarized here, you minimize waste, use few toxins, renewable feedstocks, energy efficiency, create safe products, create them under safe conditions, and use catalyzed reactions. It's almost a complete overlap. So really, if you look at nature's chemistry, it's a subset of the larger green chemistry. So what are some of the interesting chemistries that we see in nature? So here you have a white beetle, and it's white because it lives on top of white fungus. So how does it create this white color? It's embedded in their scales, but as Bryony alluded to before, in this case the whiteness is not from a chemical pigment, but actually from the structure of the scales. And these scales are actually just 5 microns thick, which is about 1/10 the thickness of a human hair. And within that thickness are these bundles of 250 micron size filaments that are grouped in bundles and kind of loosely packed so that all of the incoming visible light is reflected. So just imagine some of the uses that we have for whiteness and how we achieve that whiteness through chlorine bleach and such. And if we were able to create whiteness as nature creates whiteness, we could do without many of those substances. Another very interesting creature is the sandfish lizard. The sandfish lizard lives in the Namibian desert in Africa. And it actually swims through the sand, whereas some organisms that live in the desert, when they're scared and they need to hide, they just bury themselves in the sand. But this creature actually buries itself and swims through it. So just imagine what that could do to living tissue if you were rubbing right up against this dry, abrasive sand. It would really do quite an abrasive number on those tissues. But actually, there's no abrasion to the scales of the sandfish lizard. Scientists don't completely understand it yet, but the keratin scales seem to have kind of a sugar coating on them, sugar molecules that are attached to the keratin scales that seem to give it flexibility in combination with many sulfur compounds, also creating sulfur-sulfur bonds. And what that ends up doing is it cancels out van der Waals forces. Van der Waals forces are very short distance forces. They only work when things are really, really close together, and they create things like static cling, or it's what enables the gecko to walk up walls and across ceilings. So the chemistry, the configuration of these scales actually cancel out the van der Waals forces so that there's no attraction between the sand molecules and the scales, and that reduces the abrasion. So just imagine if we could perhaps create our industrial machinery in a similar fashion so that we would not need toxic lubricants. So we've used nature already in industry. Well, let me just take a step back here to talk about this slide, which is the abalone shell. And I use this as an example of nature's manufacturing processes. So not only are the features of nature quite amazing in their attributes, but also the actual manufacturing process is under life-friendly conditions. So you may already know that the abalone shell nacre is one of the hardest substances, and it rivals the most high-tech ceramics. In fact, it surpasses the high-tech ceramics in their ability to resist cracking, given the nanoscale brick-like motifs, so cracks can't propagate through it. But the manufacturing process is very interesting. It's really just made, the shells are made of calcium carbonate, so it's the same substance as chalk. But given its configuration is what gives it its properties. So the way the abalone shell, or the way the abalone creates new shell, it's living in this marine water environment. It secretes a protein that self-assembles into the framework for what will be the new shell. It then secretes another protein that's so-called a wallpaper protein, because it self-assembles onto the inside surfaces of this first protein. And the ends of this protein are such that it triggers the crystallization of the calcium and the carbonate ions that are dissolved in the water to crystallize out into these small brick-like motifs. And the protein that was secreted at first, it remains behind in between all of these brick-like motifs and acts as a mortar which also gives some resilience to the shell. The diatoms pictured here, which are also microscopic organisms, they do the same type of protein-mediated crystallization. But instead of calcium carbonate, they use silicates for the simple reason that silicates are what is abundant and available to them. Now, we may sort of have the assumption that the living world and the industrial world are really diametrically opposed. But I pose that they're actually two sides of the same coin. So if you look at how the living world differs from the inanimate natural world, the inanimate natural world is passive. It just is energy flowing downhill. So water always flows downhill. If you put metals or other degradable materials out in nature, they will degrade. But what's different about the living world is that the living world harnesses energy and uses it in a controlled way to build complex systems. So look at green plants, for example. They take the energy of incoming photons, they convert that into a flow of electrons that power the cellular machinery that is then able to take carbon dioxide from the air and create all of the complex carbon-based compounds that we find in plants. So it's not just the structural materials, the cellulose, but the vitamins, the phytopharmaceuticals, the enzymes, the proteins, the venoms, the pigments, the flavors, everything that we get from plants. Similarly, industry digs up coal or other fossil fuels, burns them to create steam, to turn a turbine, to create electricity, to power refineries that create ethylene, that are the building blocks of all of the complex carbon-based substances that we make, whether they be fibers or pharmaceuticals or plastics, textiles, pigments, flavors, fragrance, lubricants, etc. The difference is that living organisms are able to do this using renewable energy, using water-based processes, leveraging self-assembly at ambient temperatures and pressures, and using life-friendly substances. Whereas modern industry, for the most part, is still using non-renewable energy sources, petrochemical feedstocks, heat, beat, and treat, high temperatures and pressures, that is, methods of manufacturing, and often using, generating, and incorporating into products toxic and hazardous substances. So as I started saying before, industry already does to some degree utilize nature. So for example, we may add green plants to one of the processes in a water treatment facility. We may utilize mold, bacteria, yeast, or other microorganisms to produce useful products for us and then extract those products. Or we may just go out into the forest, into the wilderness, and harvest those products directly. But biomimicry is a different way of approaching nature. It's looking at nature as a mentor, as a new way of viewing and valuing nature, not on what we can extract from nature, but what we can learn from nature. So looking at nature as mentor, model, and measure. Model because there are at least 30,000 species, and each one of those species has at least a handful, if not a football-sized field full of interesting strategies, and is measured to know just what works in terms of sustainability. Because if sustainability really means being in sync with the natural world, then what better source of inspiration than in the natural world itself? So let me give you an example of biomimicry and how that's different than the way we utilize nature up until now. So these are blue sea mussels, and attached tenaciously to rocks in the nearshore areas. This picture obviously was taken at low tide when they're exposed, but the reason they attach themselves to the rocks at the near shore is because when the tide comes up, in these turbulent waters, there's a lot of their food suspended so they can feed. But they need to really be able to grab on to the rocks or whatever substrate is around really strongly, not also just thrown around in the turbulence. So a wood scientist from the University of Oregon took a walk along the coast in Oregon, where these types of sea stacks and such are a rather common sight, and he was rather taken with how strongly these organisms are attached to the rock. So he took them back to the laboratory and examined how the adhesive proteins are actually structured from a chemical point of view. And then thought, well, you know, he had a choice of either saying these are great adhesives, they're made underwater, they work underwater, they work on rough surfaces. Why don't we harvest these creatures, crush them up, and then extract the protein adhesive and then sell it? That would have been one alternative, but what he tried to do instead, you know, he thought back in the old days for wood adhesives, before there were the current formaldehyde-based adhesives, they were soy-based adhesives, but soy-based adhesives don't work quite as well as formaldehyde-based adhesives. But the problem with formaldehyde-based adhesives is that when you put the wood products into your home and you close the doors and windows, that the formaldehyde can off-gas and cause sick building syndrome. So he looked at the adhesive protein, the chemical structure of it. He looked at the soy protein, which is cheap and abundant, and the chemical structure of that. And he figured, you know, if he could just take off some of the key functional groups from the adhesive protein from the sea mussel and attach it to the soy protein, you could get a soy protein that's a much more effective adhesive. So long story short, he developed a soy-based adhesive that's now used by a high-end cabinet maker called Columbia Forest Products. So Columbia Forest Products, in their high-end plywood has to be attached. You know, each of the layers in plywood have to be glued together. They were able to completely eliminate the formaldehyde-based adhesive and are just using this pure bond-based adhesive. Perhaps the holy grail of biomimicry is photosynthesis, both the carbon compound manufacturing process using carbon dioxide, and also the energy generation using sunlight. So I'm going to talk about both of those. The first is the chemical manufacturing part of it. So a professor by the name of Jeffrey Coates had been looking at photosynthesis for a long time. And he noticed that, you know, carbon dioxide is a very stable molecule. Carbon dioxide does not want to react, it just wants to stay the way it is. So that's what makes it a little bit difficult to use as a starting material. So how is it that green plants and photosynthetic organisms are able to utilize carbon dioxide? And the answer is the Rubisco enzyme, which is probably one of the most ubiquitous enzymes in all of nature. The Rubisco enzyme used in the Calvin cycle is actually what is able to break those bonds and create a molecule that then becomes the starting material for the sugars and then everything else that that plants make. So he created a mimic of this enzyme. He didn't try to extract the enzyme. He looked at the metal reaction center of the enzyme and has gone through a few iterations, but has been able to mimic it so that it actually does utilize carbon dioxide at rates that are relevant to industry. and is able now to produce polycarbonate plastics and a series of other polymers using carbon dioxide and limonene oxide, which is from the peels of citrus fruits. So otherwise, polycarbonate plastics, as all of you probably know, are made using bisphenol A. And they tend not to biodegrade. So these polycarbonate plastics do not require bisphenol A, and they biodegrade. And the company is called Novomer. So on the other side of it, the energy generation of photosynthesis, one of the, or probably the main reason that photosynthetic plants are able to capture sunlight and turn it into energy is because they've mastered the art of charge separation. Positive, negative charges in molecules, they want to stay together. And if you can separate them momentarily, they want to come right back together. But what the chloroplasts in green plants have done, they're able to pull the photon in, excite an electron from chlorophyll that momentarily escapes, and to keep the chlorophyll from grabbing it back, there's a whole electron transport chain that handles that charge just like a game of hot potato. So it sends it along before the chlorophyll molecule can get it back. So a couple of Swiss scientists have taken that idea, and what they did, instead of chlorophyll, they use a ruthenium dye, and they attach it to nano-sized crystals of titanium dioxide. They sandwich it in between two transparent glass slides and immerse it all in an iodide, triiodide redox complex. So what happens is when there's incoming sunlight, the photon hits the ruthenium dye just like it hits chlorophyll, and it excites it so that an electron is shot out. But before the ruthenium dye can grab that electron back again, it's sent through the nooks and crannies of the nano-sized titanium dioxide nanospheres to one of the glass slides, which is connected to a conducting wire that conducts it over to the other side. And in the meantime, the iodide triiodide complex acts as the redox couple, so it's giving the electron back to the ruthenium dye when it needs it, and then taking it when it comes over the circuit, completing the circuit. So this company is called Canarpa, that has created these dye-sensitized solar cells. The coral reef has inspired the creation of a new way of making cement. So cement is calcium carbonate, and coral reefs are also calcium carbonate. Coral reefs eventually, with tectonic action, end up being thrust out of their saltwater environment and are exposed to the fresh water of rainwater. And they remain calcium carbonate, but they change a little bit in their crystal formation to one that's more stable in fresh water. So when we make cement, and cement manufacture is probably one of the major contributors to the generation of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere, we mine the limestone that at one time was a coral reef. We mine that limestone, but then we heat it to perhaps 2,000 degrees for a long period of time in order to get the crystal structure of the calcium carbonate to be something that's unstable in fresh water, so that after we cooled it off and we crush it down and we use it in cement and we add water to it, it will then reconform and harden back into something that's stable in fresh water. So a company called Calera has come up with a way of sidestepping that heating process by looking at how it is that the corals make the calcium carbonate solid structures in the marine water in the first place. So the marine water, of course, is has a high salt content, and there is carbon dioxide that dissolves in that water. So what Cholera came up with is a process where they take brine solutions and they spray it through the exhaust gases coming out from a coal-fired power plant, let's say, that's rich in carbon dioxide. So given the very high salt content of the brine solution, there's kind of a nucleation process that goes on that triggers the carbon dioxide that's in the exhaust fumes from the power plant to dissolve in the water and then convert to bicarbonate. Once that bicarbonate is captured, it's then treated with to a higher pH, where it then precipitates out as solid calcium carbonate, but solid calcium carbonate not in the same form as limestone that we mine, but in the same form that it is in the coral reef, which means it's stable in salt water but not stable in fresh water. So if you then take this dry calcium carbonate and you mix it with aggregate and such, and then you add fresh water, it then converts to a form of calcium carbonate that's stable in fresh water and in the process hardens. So imagine if we could be making most of our cement with this type of process, how we would not only be reducing the generation of carbon dioxide from the heating of the limestone in the first place, but we would be removing carbon dioxide from emission sources. Another company that's also trying to have an impact on atmospheric carbon dioxide is a company called CO2 Solutions. And if you remember back in your school days when you would do an experiment where you take chalk and you crush it up and you add a little bit of acid to it, that it would start bubbling because the acid would make the calcium carbonate convert to carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide would bubble up. So what CO2 Solutions has attempted to do is to turn that on its head, to go from the carbon dioxide and have that precipitate down to solid calcium carbonate. So what they've done, in many mollusks, there is an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. And that enzyme functions to speed up the rate at which carbon dioxide dissolves in water to form carbonic acid. Because once that happens, the carbonic acid then changes to bicarbonate. But it's a very slow process. The process of carbon dioxide changing to carbonic acid is a very slow process. So various mollusks have devised, in fact it's in many organisms, the carbonic anhydrase enzyme to speed up that process. So what CO2 Solutions has done is they've taken a biodegradable type of bead and they've adhered the enzyme covalently to all of these beads. So when an exhaust from, let's say, a power plant goes up this stack that's full of these enzyme-coated beads, and a fluid comes down the other way, the carbon dioxide is quickly dissolved to carbonic acid, and then quickly on its own converts to bicarbonate. The bicarbonate is then collected and either purified to CO2 that's used for dry ice and critical CO2 and whatever other uses CO2 is used in, or it can take it further to carbonate and sequester it, thereby pulling it out of the atmosphere. Biofilms are a huge problem in both the corrosion of materials like ship hulls and also in disease. Many of the diseases that inflict us are created because bacteria can form these biofilms that then protect themselves with a sugar coating so that it's hard for medicines to really do anything about them. But a biologist was swimming through various types of algae and noticed that one type of algae, a red algae, had no biofilm on it, whereas other types of algae in the same area did have biofilm. So he did some experimentation and found out that what this red algae did was excrete a compound called furanones. And what the furanones do is they don't kill the bacteria, they just interrupt the bacteria's communication ability so that the bacteria that may be nearby never get the message that here's a place to create a biofilm. So they just never do. So what he did was create a company to create furanones so that they can be used to avoid biofilms in the first place, rather than have to treat the symptoms of biofilms afterwards. And if something like furanones are used to control bacteria, the bacteria don't realize that they're being threatened, so they never develop a resistance to them, unlike antibiotics. As Bryony mentioned before, the blue color of the morpho butterfly is actually created through structure, not through pigment. So there are numerous layers that have nanoscale air spaces in them. So there are layers, there are columns, there are all sorts of structures, and in these air spaces, it plays with light in such a way similar to how the white beetle that I showed at first, except in this case, it plays with light so that blue light is emitted. So there's a company called Tangent that created this product called Morphotex. It's a polyester fiber that comes in 4 colors but use no dyes or pigments. It's all based on 60 layers worth of structure that impart these different colors. You might all be familiar with the lotus effect and some of the products that have come out of the lotus effect. As I mentioned earlier about the sea mussels and their adhesive actually being able to be used underwater, that's pretty incredible, because any kind of solid material would like to, or any kind of adhesive would like to adhere to water, and water would like to adhere to solid particles. So nature's kind of used those traits to create surfaces that instead of being smooth, they have nanostructures. Water left on its own because of its surface tension, it's going to create a sphere because all the water molecules are attracted to each other. But if there's a flat surface, because of the strong attraction between water and solid surfaces, the water is going to want to just spread out and essentially wet the surface. So the surface of the lotus leaf is such that there are many nanoscale bumps, and there are air spaces in between. So a droplet of water can never come in contact with enough solid surface, so the attractive forces between the water molecules are greater than the attractive forces with any of the solid surface of the leaf, so the water stays as a sphere. And if there's any angle to the leaf, the sphere is just going to roll off. And as it's rolling off, again, because solid materials have an affinity for water, as the sphere is rolling off, it's going to capture particles and take it off of the leaf. So there are a number of products that have been created based on the lotus effect. One is lotus sand paint, which in its curing process creates this nanoscale surface that does not allow water to wet, but rather beat up, and so rainwater actually carries dirt away. Most living things, if they're allowed to dry, will die because of all the salts in our fluid within our cells will begin to crystallize, just as if you left the saltwater solution out and you let it dry, you'll see the salt crystals form. And very often crystals are in very sharp type of configurations, and those sharp configurations can rupture a cell wall. And once the cell wall is ruptured, there's really no saving it. But there are certain organisms like the resurrection plant, here shown completely dry. Once it's rehydrated, it comes back to life. And the way it does this is that also dissolved in its cytoplasm, in the water environment, in its cells, is a sugar called trehalose. And when trehalose desiccates, rather than crystallize, it becomes a glassy substance. So instead of forming sharp crystals, it's just this rather benign glass type of shape. And since that happens, there's no rupturing of the cell walls. And once there's rehydration, the trehalose dissolves again, releasing the other salt, and the normal medicine is allowed to continue. Even more than the resin plant, the tardigrade, which also utilizes trehalose, can completely dehydrate for many, many years, for decades. It's been subject to near absolute zero temperatures, to exceedingly extremely hot temperatures, and yet once it's rehydrated, it comes back to life. So a company has taken this idea of trehalose being able to give microorganisms the ability to completely desiccate, and it's applied it to viruses. To vaccines, because many vaccines rely on microorganisms to transfer the function to the recipient of the vaccine. And vaccines have to be refrigerated in order to keep these microorganisms viable. So what this company has done is been able to apply trehalose to these cells so that they're allowed to completely desiccate, which means in their transport they do not need to be refrigerated. And by just injecting them into the body, the water content of the body allows them to rehydrate, where they can then go about their function. Probably one of my favorite examples is the bombardier beetle. The bombardier beetle, in its abdomen, when it feels like it's being attacked, it mixes peroxide and hydroquinone, which immediately heats to the boiling point, and then a valve is able to open and close about 500 to 1,000 times per second, spraying this hot toxic liquid at its enemy. So there's a company that's looking at the valve actually to see how this fast-acting valve that can handle toxic and very hot substances, how can that valve be used in jet engines that have stalled while in flight. So there's a company that's actually working on creating valves based on the bombardier beetle. We haven't quite figured out yet how the bombardier beetle is able to withstand the onslaught of its own toxic soup, but that's something that is being worked on. InterfaceFLOR is a company that we work with, and they're a very successful carpeting manufacturing company. And so they decided that, okay, they're making a lot of money. How can they now reduce their waste streams that are generated when they make and lay tiles? So they wanted to use biomimicry and sort of look at how can we look at nature? How does nature create a sustainable design pattern? So what they looked at, just walking through the woods, is that there are patterns in nature that look as though they're homogeneous, but if you look at them really closely, they're made of many unique parts with different shapes, different colors, different shapes, different orientations. It's kind of an organized chaos, but when you put it all together, it gives kind of an overall pattern, and you see it all over nature. So what InterfaceFLORs did was take that idea and came up with these carpet tiles that utilize the fact that no two pieces are exactly alike. There's different shades, kind of this organized chaos. And what that enabled them to do was reduce waste, because usually when somebody, first of all, buys a carpet, they buy extra carpet because if something happens to the carpet they've installed and they have to replace any of it, it's hard to make the exact same batch. So they buy extra to be able to replace it if they need to. And in the manufacture of the carpet tiles, if there are any mistakes in the batches, they need to be thrown out. So InterfaceFLOR has been able to reduce the amount of manufacturing waste because they can use all of the batches. It doesn't matter if there are variations, and the buyers do not have to buy extra carpet. If they need to replace any carpet, they can always buy whatever batch is coming out at that particular time that will still work. So what this really taught the company was that sustainability can go hand in hand with high-quality design and a well-designed product. And this Entropy carpet, I think, became about 25% of Entropy of Interface's sales. So they decided, okay, well, we tackled that problem. Can we also tackle the problem?
Mark, this is really, really interesting, and all the examples have been fascinating, but we're quickly running out of time on our call, and I was hoping that we could, you know, have a little bit of time left for some questions. So I hate to interrupt you, just when we're getting to the interesting picture of the whatever that animal was. Maybe we could open it up to questions in a minute or two. Okay.
Well, anyway, they did come up with a solution to that, so they no longer need glues, but we'll come back to that at another time. What I want to just end with is to let all of you know, if you don't already know, about asknature.org, which is a website that the Institute started and runs, which is a freely available, accessible website, which is unique because it organizes nature by function. So rather than how biological information is usually ordered, you know, by kingdom, phylum, class, that sort of thing, this is organized. This organizes biological information by function. So how nature makes color, how nature makes adhesives, how nature waterproofs, etc. So I encourage you, if you haven't already, to go to asknature.org and to play around with it. So I will end here, and we can open it up to questions.
Thank you so much. We've got about 5 or 6 minutes left for any questions. So Clinton will unmute people, and you can jump right in. Or if you're listening on your computer, you can enter your question and send it to us, and we'll be glad to answer your question. And while we're waiting, I actually have a question, which is this is so interesting, but I'm wondering how, you know, it was very interesting to see the examples and how they turned into actual products, but I'm not a chemist, and I'm sort of wondering, scale up, and do they synthesize the chemicals that they're finding? How do they, you know, end up with, do they recreate the process? Could you clarify that a little bit?
It's different in different examples. So the pure bond, they did not recreate the chemical. They just took examples from the natural chemical design and sort of redesigned another chemical and created something new. In terms of Novomer and those polycarbonate plastics, they just looked at the reaction center of the enzyme. Your enzymes are very complex molecules, but what's really key is the reaction center. And so that is what they created a new enzyme reaction center as opposed to a whole new enzyme. But I mean, you know, biomimicry, if you're going to start with a new challenge and look to nature for inspiration and come up with a solution, it's not, you know, quite as easy as just looking for something off the shelf. It takes a lot of research and trial and error. But clearly, from these examples, there are successes that do scale up. Not all of them will, of course, but that isn't true. I mean, that's true in any kind of new chemistries you're creating.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a question. What concerns do you have about the misuse of nanoscale materials, which nature seems to handle so well?
Well, that's something that we're actually beginning to look at now. You know, nature definitely uses nanotechnology. So from that reason alone, there's a lot to learn from nature. How does nature manufacture the nanoparticles, first of all? What does nature make the nanoparticles out of? And how does nature manage those nanoparticles afterwards so that they don't create a hazard? One thing we do know is there's a variety of ways that organisms, either through protein secretions or whatever, make sure that nanoparticles are aggregated. Because once you've aggregated nanoparticles, at least you've taken away the impact of the very small size.
Now, I will just add that Mark and a few of our folks are going to be working on a nanotechnology paper about how nature manages nanotechnology, so keep an eye out for that in the coming months.
Oh, that's great. We have another question. I think we can squeeze another question in. Are most of these chemical applications coming out of a specific need, or are they trying to be sustainable? Which comes first in most of these applications?
You know, I think there's a variety of criteria and approaches. It depends, you know, is it a company that's trying to create a new product? Is it just an academic researcher? From our point of view, sustainability is just as important, but if you're utilizing, you know, you're getting your inspiration from nature, there's kind of this built-in sustainability. But, you know, just as the green chemistry gurus say, you know, what we're looking for in even biomimetic products is sustainability, performance, and...
We're going to get cut off in 10 seconds. We need to end the session.
Yeah, let him just finish his sentence. Mark?
So that's what I was saying. It's both sustainability, cost, and performance that even, you know, a lot of biomimicists are looking for in their products.
Well, thank you so much. This has been really interesting. I want to remind everybody again of our next webinar on August the 3rd with David Levine. And check out our website, www.glgc.org, for more information. And thanks again to Bryony and Mark for this presentation. Goodbye, everyone.